David Chaudoir shared that his tenure at the BBC was relatively brief, spanning from 2022 to 2024 as a freelance graphic designer working primarily on Newsnight. With 35 years of experience in graphic design, including senior roles at Fox and National Geographic, he entered the BBC after lockdown and quickly appreciated the fast-paced environment. However, health challenges, including a fourth heart attack, curtailed his time there. The core issue David exposed involved a manipulated edit of former President Donald Trump's January 6th speech broadcast by Panorama, a flagship BBC program. The edited clip spliced sections of Trump's speech nearly an hour apart, creating a fabricated narrative that inaccurately portrayed Trump as directly inciting violence at the Capitol. David recognized the misuse of footage, reached out to the Daily Telegraph, who subsequently broke the story, and revealed this was not a one-off. Similar manipulations had appeared earlier during his time at Newsnight. Following the airing of the doctored clip, David attended editorial meetings where the issue was discussed. Despite a producer questioning how such an edit was allowed to go out, senior staff shrugged it off, effectively normalizing the falsehood. No apology or retraction was issued, and the piece remained on BBC iPlayer. David described this response as extraordinary and indicative of a culture where objectivity was compromised. His position as a graphic designer gave him a unique vantage point to observe newsroom dynamics and withheld corrections. David and the hosts delved into whether the clip constituted election interference. The edited footage potentially influenced public opinion, especially among American expatriates in the UK who could vote, by framing Trump in a misleading light during a critical electoral moment. While legally proving election interference may be difficult, David emphasized that the act of doctoring footage indeed impacts democratic processes through deceit and misrepresentation. David recounted instances highlighting ideological bias within the BBC. Correspondents openly discussed weaving politically charged topics like Brexit into stories or linking Trump's supporters to QAnon based on podcasts rather than verified evidence. These examples illustrated a newsroom echo chamber where certain narratives dominated unquestioned. Conversations overheard underscored a disconnect between staff perceptions and realities faced by ordinary viewers. The discussion touched on Newsnight's erosion in viewership, dropping from over 1 million in its heyday to under 100,000. The program shifted from objective journalism to offering commentary that often told viewers how to think. David described this as a major error that contributed to the show's declining relevance. The BBC's reduced public support, shown by hundreds of thousands refusing to pay the license fee, was linked to such shifts in editorial approach. David shared his experience with graphic design decisions relating to political figures. A requested change to a graphic of Joe Biden, initially depicting him appearing pensive with his finger to his mouth, was replaced with a more traditionally presidential image. This suggested an editorial intention to avoid visuals implying cognitive decline. By contrast, David was able to sneak through a graphic featuring a "Let's Go Brandon" message without objection, highlighting inconsistencies in editorial tolerance. David recounted overhearing producers casually discussing a story about an alleged underage Afghan taxi driver at a local school, a topic never formally pursued by the BBC despite its potential newsworthiness. These moments illustrated a culture of informal passing around stories without rigorous vetting or follow-up, contributing to perceptions of selective reporting. The conversation explored the systemic causes behind editorial missteps. A lack of diverse viewpoints and leadership willing to enforce impartiality allowed biased and groupthink-driven narratives to flourish. David stressed that the BBC's public mandate demands a nonpartisan approach, something it failed to uphold in these cases. Diverging perceptions of the BBC's bias from left and right highlighted internal contradictions and alienated large segments of the audience. David agreed with host observations that BBC staffing is dominated by a narrow demographic, mostly university-educated, middle-class professionals concentrated in metropolitan areas like London. This homogeneity contributes to a disconnect from many parts of the UK, whose communities and values remain underrepresented in news coverage. True diversity, David argued, transcends ethnicity and gender to include geography, class, and political thought. Reports of correspondents living in Westminster bubbles with easy political access contrasted sharply with realities outside the capital. Even efforts to represent regional areas often involve jetting in out-of-town teams rather than incorporating local voices. This institutional insularity was reflected in the rhetoric and editorial choices, which often failed to acknowledge the complexity and plurality of British society. David expressed affection for the BBC's historical role and the trust it once earned, often recalling how his grandfather turned to the BBC World Service as a beacon of free information during Soviet times. He lamented the erosion of that trust caused by visible breaches of journalistic ethics, particularly when fabrications or misleading edits are broadcast. Restoring that trust is essential, but immensely challenging. David proposed significant structural changes for the future of the BBC. He doubted the sustainability of the license fee funding model in an era of diverse media options and shifting consumption habits. Instead, he advocated for a leaner, subscription-based service focusing on a clearer remit, whether primarily news or entertainment, rather than trying to be all things to all people. The institution must prioritize integrity, objectivity, and transparency to remain relevant. The ideological homogeneity within the BBC workforce, often described as left-wing, was not manifest in overt activism, but rather in subtle cultural alignment. Efforts to inject dissenting or right-of-center views met resistance or were marginalized. There was little structural support for ideological diversity, and many staff felt constrained or disinclined to voice dissenting opinions in editorial meetings or production discussions. Concerns extended beyond news output into drama, comedy, and children's programming, where progressive narratives appeared weighted toward identity politics or ideological messaging. Shows like Doctor Who and others included themes that alienated traditional viewers. The editorial approach, David argued, pervaded all BBC content, diminishing its role as a broad cultural institution and increasing perceptions of bias. David emphasized the stark gulf between BBC producers and many viewers across socioeconomic and geographical lines. This disconnect was not simply about content, but core values and lived experience. The absence of diverse editorial perspectives and the persistence of a London-centric worldview contributed to dwindling audiences and widespread disillusionment with the broadcaster. David encouraged independent content creators and outlets to fill the void left by traditional broadcasters. He praised platforms like Triggernometry for offering alternative viewpoints and suggested expanding into original drama, comedy, and other formats free from institutional ideological constraints. He saw potential in crowdfunding and grassroots initiatives as part of a broader media ecosystem capable of challenging entrenched narratives. Ultimately, David's message was one of both warning and hope. The BBC retains a unique cultural and historical position, but must recommit to journalistic principles of accuracy, neutrality, and broad representation if it is to survive and thrive. Leadership change, structural reform, and increased ideological diversity are critical. Without them, the institution risks continued decline and loss of trust from the public it serves.